Louisa Norris had one boot on the porch step, and her traveling bag gripped so tight in her fist that her knuckles had gone bone white when the small hands found her. They came around her waist from behind, two thin arms locking together at her middle, with a desperation that no 6-year-old should have possessed. And the grip was so fierce, so suddenly complete, that the breath rushed straight out of Louisa's lungs as if she had been caught by a lasso rather than a child. "Please don't go," Maddie whispered against the back of Louisa's dress. "Please, I don't want you to go away like Mama did." The words hit Louisa somewhere so deep and so raw that she could not move, not forward, not backward. She stood there on that porch step with the last copper light of a dying October afternoon bleeding across the Texas hill country, and she felt the entire architecture of her carefully constructed plan collapse around her like a burning barn. She had timed it perfectly. She had waited until Henry Hadley rode the far fence line, waited until his eldest son Caleb took the two middle children to water the horses, waited until every reasonable obstacle between herself and the road to Fredericksburg had cleared. She had written the note. It was still folded in the pocket of her skirt, pressed against her hip, the ink still fresh enough to smudge if she reached for it. She had told herself 100 times over the past 3 weeks that this was not her life to keep, that she was only the housekeeper, that she had no right to the warmth she had begun to feel every time Henry Hadley walked into a room, that she had no right to his children's love, most of all, because she carried a secret that would destroy every fragile thing they had all begun to build together. And then Maddie's arms tightened, and Louisa's bag dropped to the porch boards, and she stood there unable to leave and unable to stay, suspended between two terrible futures by the grip of a 6-year-old girl who had already lost too much. That was the moment everything changed. But to understand why Louisa was leaving at all, and why that child's embrace was powerful enough to rewrite the course of her life, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the morning in September of 1878 when Louisa Norris stepped off a westbound stagecoach in Mason County, Texas, with $47, a bruised heart, and a secret she intended to carry to her grave. The town of Hadley Creek had not been named after Henry Hadley, though everyone assumed it had. It had been named after his father, who had built the first mill and the first proper trading post in the valley back in 1851, and who had died of cholera in 1869, leaving Henry, then 22 years old, with 2,000 acres of hill country limestone and cedar, and a debt that would have broken a lesser man clean in half. Henry had not broken. That much was obvious to anyone who looked at him. He was 31 now, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from real work rather than vanity, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar when he went too long between trips to the barber, which was almost always. His eyes were a gray-green color that changed with the weather, and he had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that made up the hills around his ranch, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into the sun and from grief in roughly equal measure. His wife, Clara, had died 14 months before Louisa arrived. Fever. It had come fast and taken her in 9 days, and it had left Henry with 4 children ranging from 6-year-old Maddie to 15-year-old Caleb, and a ranch that demanded every waking hour he had. He had not been looking for a housekeeper. His neighbor, a stout and cheerful woman named Mrs. Kramer, had placed the advertisement in the San Antonio paper without his knowledge or his permission, on the grounds that, as she told him flatly when he found out, a man who was burning his own beans 3 nights a week and letting his youngest daughter wear the same dress for 5 days running was a man who needed intervention whether he wanted it or not. Louisa had answered the advertisement not because she was looking for a position in the hill country of Texas, but because she was looking for a place where no one would find her. She had come from Austin, originally from Virginia before that, and she was 26 years old with excellent references from 2 previous households, and a third reference she could never produce because The third household was the source of everything she was running from. She had worked for a man named Gerald Parson for 11 months. Gerald Parson was 44 years old, a land speculator with a wife who spent most of her time in Dallas with her sister, and Gerald Parson had decided, by the third month of Louisa's employment, that her position in his household entitled him to things that no employer was entitled to demand. She had resisted. She had done so quietly, then firmly, then in terms that should have left no ambiguity whatsoever. And then one evening he had come to her room with whiskey on his breath and a contract in his hand, a contract transferring a small parcel of land to a man named Delaney who happened to be her brother, a transfer that would save her brother from a debt that was crushing him, and he had told her very plainly what he wanted in exchange. Louisa had picked up the oil lamp from her nightstand and thrown it at Gerald Parsons' head. She had not stayed long enough to discover whether she had connected. She had grabbed her bag and her money, and she had been out the back door and into the alley within 30 seconds, and by morning she was on a coach heading west, and by the following week she was answering an advertisement in a newspaper, and by the end of September she was standing in front of Henry Hadley's door in Mason County, Texas, with the bruise of that whole humiliating episode still somewhere beneath her breastbone. What she had not told anyone, not the neighbor woman Mrs. Kramer who met her at the stage, not the postmaster who handled her one letter of correspondence, and certainly not Henry Hadley, was that Gerald Parson was not a man inclined to accept humiliation quietly. Gerald Parson had connections, he had money, and he had filed a complaint with the county sheriff in Austin claiming that Louisa Norris had stolen a diamond brooch from his household before leaving. It was a lie, an absolute, vicious, deliberately constructed lie. But it was the kind of lie that had teeth in 1878, because a woman without family and without money had very few resources with which to fight it, and because Gerald Parson was exactly the kind of man who understood how to use the law as a weapon. Louisa did not know, when she stepped off the stage in Hadley Creek, that there was already a wanted notice being circulated to sheriff's offices across central Texas with her name on it. She did not know that Gerald Parson had hired a man to track her. She did not know that the machinery of her destruction had already been set in motion. She only knew that the hill country was beautiful in September, that the cedar trees smelled clean and sharp in the morning air, and that a small girl with dark braids and her father's gray-green eyes had opened the door of the Hadley Ranch house and looked up at her with an expression of such pure and unguarded hope that Louisa's throat had tightened immediately. "Are you the new lady?" Mattie had asked. "I think I might be," Louisa had said, and that was how it started. Henry Hadley had not been warm to her at first. He had been polite, which was different. He had shown her the house with a kind of careful formality, explained the children's schedules and the household accounts with the efficiency of a man who had already decided that emotion was a luxury he could not afford. He had offered her a fair wage, a private room at the back of the house with a good window facing the hills, and 3 days off each month. He had not asked her much about herself, which she appreciated more than he knew. The children were a different matter entirely. Caleb, the eldest at 15, was self-possessed and watchful, with his father's reserve but none of the warmth that occasionally cracked through Henry's composure. He looked at Louisa the way a person looks at something they intend to find fault with, and she understood why. He had loved his mother deeply, and he was not yet old enough to distinguish between loyalty to the dead and cruelty to the living. The twins, James and Nora, who were 10, had accepted her with the pragmatic speed of children who primarily want someone to help them find their missing things and arbitrate their arguments, which were frequent and creative. And Mattie had simply attached herself to Louisa like iron filings to a magnet, with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and complicated, because Louisa knew from the first week that she could not allow herself to love that child back with the fullness the child deserved. Not when she was living on borrowed time. Not when every morning she woke expecting to hear a horse coming up the road with bad news in its saddlebags. But love, as Louisa was discovering, was not a thing you could regulate by deciding against it. It crept in through the gaps your defenses hadn't thought to cover. It came in through Maddie's hand in hers when they walked to the creek. It came in through James's proud face when she helped him work out a long division problem that had been defeating him for a week. It came in through Nora's shy, delighted smile when Louisa braided her hair the way Louisa's own mother had braided hers in Virginia a lifetime ago. And it came in, most dangerously of all, through Henry Hadley. Not through anything dramatic or obvious. Not through anything Louisa could have pointed to and said, "There, that is where my resolution failed." It came in slowly, in the way that the best and most dangerous things always do. It came in through the evening. He stayed up past midnight working over his account ledgers at the kitchen table, and she brought him coffee without being asked. And he looked up with such unguarded exhaustion and quiet gratitude that something in her chest moved in a way it had no business moving. It came in through the afternoon. She found him in the barn sitting in the hay with Maddie asleep across his lap, both of them napping in the late September warmth. And the look of complete peace on his face in sleep was so different from the careful control he wore when he was awake that she stood at the barn door for a full minute before she remembered herself and went back to the house. It came in through the Sunday morning in early October when the preacher had spoken about loss, and Henry had sat absolutely still in the pew with his jaw set, and his hands folded, and his children ranged around him. And Louisa, sitting at the end of the row, had seen his hand move to where Maddie had tucked herself against his side, and the way his fingers rested on the little girl's shoulder was the most eloquent thing she had ever witnessed. It came in through every conversation they had in the kitchen after the children were in bed, conversations that had started as practical discussions of supply lists and household accounts, and had gradually, without either of them explicitly agreeing to it, become something else entirely. He had asked her once in the second week of October where she had learned to read accounts so well. She had told him her father had been a school teacher, which was true, and that he had taught her the same as he'd taught any student, which was also true. "My father thought women's education was a waste," Henry said, not with approval, just as a statement of fact. He came around by the end. Clara could calculate faster than any man in the county. He paused. She used to say it was the only thing more reliable than a good horse. It was the first time he had mentioned Clara's name to Louisa directly, and she understood what it cost him, the small fracture in his composure that he sealed over almost immediately, the way a man seals over a crack in a wall before the weather gets to it. "She sounds like she was extraordinary," Louisa said quietly. "She was," he said. And then, after a long silence, "What made you come all the way out here? You had good references. You could have worked anywhere in Austin." Louisa had been prepared for this question. She had been preparing for it for weeks. "I wanted something different," she said, "something quieter." He had looked at her then with those gray-green eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he did not entirely believe her but was too courteous to say so. "Hill country's quiet enough," he said finally, "though it has its own particular kind of loud come spring." She had smiled, and he had smiled back, and that was the first time she had seen his smile without reserve, the full version of it, and it was absolutely catastrophic for her composure. By the middle of October, Louisa understood that she was in serious trouble of the heart, and that the honorable thing to do was to leave before she made it worse, before the children became more attached, before she had to tell Henry the truth about why she had come and watch the warmth in those gray-green eyes turn to something colder, before Gerald Parsons' man found her, which she was increasingly afraid was only a matter of time. She had been in town twice since arriving, once to the dry goods store and once to the post office, and both times she had felt the particular anxiety of a person who knows they are being searched for. She had kept her bonnet low. She had given her name as Miss Norris without the Louisa, Small precautions that might mean nothing, that might mean everything. She began planning her departure the second week of October. She told herself she would leave by the end of the month. She saved a portion of her wages each week, adding them to the $47, building a fund that would take her further west, to San Angelo maybe, or further still. Somewhere the name Louisa Norris hadn't yet traveled. She told herself that leaving was the right thing, the responsible thing. The only thing that protected Henry and his children from the consequences of harboring a woman with a false accusation and a man with money hunting her down. She told herself all of this every night for 2 weeks, and every morning she woke up and made breakfast and watched the children come downstairs and watched Henry drink his first coffee in the blue-gray morning light, and she could not make herself do it. Until the evening she overheard the conversation at the trading post. She had gone in for flour and lamp oil on a Wednesday afternoon while Caleb watched the younger children, and she had been at the back of the store near the bolts of cloth when 2 men came in and began talking to the postmaster, and she had heard her own name spoken by a stranger's mouth. "Looking for a woman by the name of Louisa Norris," the man said. He had a flat, deliberate voice, the voice of someone paid to be thorough. "Came through on the stage about a month back. Brown hair, green eyes, about 26 years old, traveling alone, has some acquaintance with household work." The postmaster, whose name was Mr. Dietrich and who was a careful and not unfriendly man, said he couldn't rightly say he knew every traveler who came through. "There's a reward," the flat-voiced man said. "Theft of personal property from a prominent Austin citizen. $50 for information leading to her whereabouts." Louisa stood absolutely still behind the bolts of calico. She did not breathe. She did not move. She listened to the flat-voiced man leave his particulars with the postmaster and walk back out into the afternoon sun. And she waited until she heard the door close. And then she waited another full minute. And then she walked to the counter and bought her flour and her lamp oil with perfect composure. And she walked back to the wagon. And she drove home. And she did not let herself fall apart until she was in her room with the door shut. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and shook for a while, quietly, with her hands folded in her lap, and she made her decision. She would leave tomorrow, not at the end of the month. Tomorrow. Before Henry found out, before the flat-voiced man came back with more questions and better luck, before everything collapsed. She spent that evening being as normal as she could manage. She made supper, a beef stew with cornbread because it was getting cold and stews stretched well, and she sat at the table while the children ate and argued about the respective merits of their horses, and she watched Henry Hadley refill James's cup without looking up from the map he was reading with his left hand, managing both tasks with the easy competence of a man who had been running a household along with a ranch for over a year, and she felt the specific pain of knowing something precious was about to end. After the children were in bed, Henry came to the kitchen and found her finishing the dishes. He leaned against the doorframe in a way that had become familiar to her, that particular angle that meant he was tired but not ready to stop talking. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "Long day," she said, which was technically true. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Louisa." He almost never used her first name. She went still. "I know I haven't said this properly," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been drafting something in his head for some time. "But having you here has made a real difference. Not just the practical parts, though Lord knows those matter, but for the children." He paused. "For Maddie especially. She smiles more than she has in over a year." Louisa kept her eyes on the dish in her hands. "She's an extraordinary child," she said. "She is," he said, and then, "I hope you're not thinking of moving on any time soon." The dish in her hands was the most interesting object she had ever encountered. She studied it with absolute concentration. "I appreciate you saying so," she said, which was not an answer, but it was all she had. She heard him shift in the doorframe. "Well, good night, Louisa. Good night, Henry." She listened to his boots cross the floor of the sitting room and go up the stairs, and she finished the dishes in silence, and she dried her hands, and she went to her room and she packed her bag. She packed it carefully and quickly, because quick and careful was the only way she could do it without falling apart again. She left the wages she owed Henry for the remaining week on the kitchen table with the note she had written. The note explained nothing specific. It said she was grateful for the position, that she was sorry for the short notice, that she wished the family every happiness. It was a coward's note, and she knew it, and she could not make herself write a better one because a better one would require the truth. She set her alarm for 5 in the morning, which was before anyone else in the household woke. She did not sleep. At 5 she rose, washed her face, put on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked through the dark and silent house toward the front door. She passed the sitting room with its cold fireplace. She passed the kitchen table where the note and the wages sat waiting. She passed the row of small boots lined up by the door, 4 pairs in descending size, a sight that very nearly broke her entirely, and she kept walking. She opened the front door. The hill country morning was cold and purple and scented with cedar, and the eastern sky had the faintest gray beginning of dawn at the edge. She stepped out onto the porch. She reached the porch step. She gripped her bag tighter. One boot descended to the lower step, and then the small hands found her waist. Maddie had come from nowhere, from the dark of the hallway, on bare feet that made no sound on the boards, and her 2 thin arms locked around Louis's middle with a strength and a desperation that stopped Louis's forward motion as completely as a wall. "Please don't go," Maddie whispered. "Please. I don't want you to go away like Mama did." And Louisa Norris stood on that porch step in the cold purple dawn with a 6-year-old's arms around her waist, and her bag dropped to the boards at her feet, and she understood with absolute clarity that her carefully constructed plan had just encountered something it was not built to survive. She could not leave. Not like this. Not with Maddie awake and holding her and terrified in the dark. She would do damage she could not repair. She turned slowly in the child's grip, the way you turn so as not to startle something frightened, and she knelt down on the cold porch boards and she put her arms around Maddie and she held her. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "I am right here." Maddie was trembling. She had been awake in the dark, probably for hours, in the particular vigilance of a child whose world had already demonstrated its capacity for sudden loss. "I heard you," she said against Louis's shoulder. "I heard you moving around last night. You were packing." Louisa closed her eyes. "How long have you been awake?" "Since always," Maddie said, which was the most heartbreaking answer she had ever received. She sat there on the cold porch boards with Maddie in her arms and the dawn lightening behind the hills and her bag sitting useless beside her, and she tried to think. She could not leave the child upset and alone on the porch. She could not take her inside without Henry hearing, and if Henry heard, he would come down, and then she would have to look him in the face after what he had said to her in the kitchen last night, and she did not know if she had the constitution for that. But she was still here. She had not left, and every minute she stayed was a minute closer to the flat-voiced man coming back with better luck and $50 worth of motivation. She was still sitting there, holding Maddie, watching the dawn come up over the hills, when she heard the boots on the stairs inside. Henry appeared in the doorway behind them. He was dressed for the day already, which meant he had been up a while himself. He took in the scene with the particular stillness of a man whose instincts had been sharpened by years of managing difficult situations, a child on the porch in the cold and Louisa with a traveling bag. His eyes went to the bag, then to Louisa's face, and she watched understanding arrive in his expression, not anger, which she had been braced for, but something more complicated and more controlled. "Maddie," he said quietly, "come inside and get your shoes, please." Maddie tightened her grip on Louisa for one fierce moment before releasing her and standing. She gave her father a look of pure accusation before marching inside, and Henry stepped aside to let her pass. Then he looked at Louisa. The morning light was growing. It was the kind of light that didn't allow for comfortable obscurity. Louisa stood up slowly from the porch boards, brushing her skirt, and she met his eyes because she had decided in the last 30 seconds that she was done being a coward. She had let cowardice make her choices for the past 3 weeks, and it had brought her to this porch at 5 in the morning, breaking a 6-year-old's heart, and that was enough. "There's a note on the kitchen table," she said. "And your wages." "I saw them," he said. He kept his voice even. "I came downstairs for coffee and found them." She nodded. "I'm sorry for the short notice." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you in trouble, Louisa?" She blinked. "I'm not asking to pry," he said. "I'm asking because you are clearly frightened of something, and you've been frightened of something since the first week you arrived. And I've been waiting for you to tell me, because it seemed like the respectful thing to do. But since you're apparently trying to leave before sunrise without saying goodbye to my children, I think we've gone past the point where respect requires me to keep pretending I haven't noticed." The length and the quiet precision of this speech, delivered in the early morning cold with that controlled expression that wasn't anger, was somehow more undoing than anything else he could have said. Louisa put her hand against the porch post. She looked at the hills. She said, "You should send me away." "I'll be the judge of that," he said. She told him. She told him all of it. Not neatly, not in the order it happened, because she had held it so long and so tightly that, when she finally released it, the whole thing came out in a rush. Gerald Parson and the contract, and the lamp and the alley and the stagecoach and the wanted notice and the flat-voiced man in the Trading Post asking about her, $50 for information. She did not cry. She had not come this far by crying, and she was not going to start now. She stood on the porch in the growing morning light, and she told the truth, and she watched Henry Hadley's face while she did it, the controlled stillness of him, the careful attention, and when she was finished she said, "So now you know. And if you want me gone before that man comes back, I understand completely." Henry said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the hills, he looked at his hands, and then he said something she had not expected. "Did you take the brooch?" "No," she said without hesitation. "I didn't think so," he said. "You don't know me well enough to know that," she said, which was honest. "I know you well enough," he said, which was more honest still. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with those gray-green eyes that had changed with the weather all these weeks, and right now they were very still and very clear in the morning light. "I have a friend in Fredericksburg," he said finally. "A lawyer, a good one, served with the district judge before he came out here. If what you're describing is slander and a false accusation, which it plainly is, there are legal avenues." Louisa shook her head. "Parson has money and connections. A lawsuit takes time and funds I don't have." "I have funds," Henry said. She stared at him. "I cannot let you, Louisa." His voice was quiet, but there was an authority in it that stopped her mid-sentence. "There is a man riding around this county telling people that a woman who works in my household is a thief. That is my business as much as it's yours." He paused. "And beyond that, it is simply wrong. And I am not a man who can sit down comfortably in the face of something plainly wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning birds were beginning in the cedar trees. Somewhere inside the house she could hear the children starting to move around. "Why did you come down at 5 in the morning?" she asked. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the foundation of one. "I couldn't sleep either," he said. Louisa picked up her traveling bag. She carried it back inside the house. She set it in her room and she closed the door. And then she went to the kitchen and she put the note in the stove, and she made coffee and she made breakfast. And when the children came down, Henry was at the table with his maps and his account books as usual. And Mattie sat beside Louisa at breakfast without a word, pressed against her side like she intended to stay there indefinitely. And Louisa put her arm around the small girl's shoulders and let herself do it. Let herself feel the warmth of it without running from it, and it was both the most frightening and the most sustaining thing she had done in months. Henry rode to Fredericksburg the following Monday. He was gone 2 days. When he returned, he came to find Louisa in the garden where she was putting the kitchen beds down for winter with Nora, and he sat on the garden wall and told her what his friend the lawyer had said. The lawyer's name was Pemberton. He had looked at the description of the wanted notice, and he had said 2 things. First, the charge was civil, not criminal, which meant the wanted notice was not a sheriff's warrant but a private posting, and it had no legal force unless Parson filed a formal criminal complaint with the district court, which he had not yet done. Second, if Louisa could produce a statement from Gerald Parsons' own household staff attesting that no brooch had been stolen, which was likely obtainable since household staff generally knew exactly what had and hadn't been taken, the entire edifice collapsed. He also said, Henry added, with a careful neutrality that she was learning to recognize as his way of approaching difficult topics, that Parsons' legal exposure for harassment and defamation is significant if you chose to pursue it. Louisa straightened up from the garden bed. She had dirt on her hands. She looked at Henry sitting on the wall with the afternoon sun behind him, and she felt the particular dizziness of a situation shifting under her feet in the direction of possibility rather than disaster. "He'll fight it," she said. "He'll lose," Henry said. "Pemberton doesn't take cases he can't win." Nora had drifted to the far end of the garden with great tact and apparent sudden interest in the winter squash, and Henry was looking at Louisa with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something open and unguarded that was the morning smile's more serious cousin. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "I want to be clear about that, not just because of the children, though the children, but for my own reasons, which I am happy to explain if you would let me, or to keep to myself if you'd prefer." Louisa's heart was doing something inconvenient. "Your own reasons," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I think you should explain them." He did. He was not a man who found declarations easy. She had understood that from the start, and so he made his declaration in the way that suited him, with specificity and honesty and a complete absence of flowery language. He told her that in the past 6 weeks he had found himself wanting to tell her things, not because he needed to tell anyone, but because he specifically wanted to tell her. He told her that he had found himself going to the kitchen after the children were in bed not because he needed coffee, but because she was there. He told her that he was aware these were not feelings a man in his position was strictly entitled to bring to a woman in hers, and that he had no wish to make her uncomfortable, and that if she found them unwelcome, he would put them back where they came from and never mention them again. He said all of this looking at the garden wall rather than at her. In the same controlled voice, he used to describe agricultural conditions and livestock prices, which was so entirely characteristic of him that she wanted to laugh and weep simultaneously. "Henry," she said. He looked at her. "I tried to leave before sunrise," she said, "specifically so that I would not have to feel what I feel when you look at me." He was very still. "So I think," she said, "that we have both been managing the same problem in different directions." He came off the wall and crossed the garden to her in 4 long strides, and he took her face in both his hands, dirt and all, and he kissed her. It was not a hesitant kiss, not a questioning kiss, not the kind of kiss that leaves room for revision. It was the kiss of a man who had been deliberate about everything for so long that when he finally decided to act, he acted completely. Louisa had both hands on his chest and the garden soil still on her palms and the winter sun on her face, and it was the most fully present she had felt in months. When they separated, Nora was pretending with deep commitment to have discovered something extraordinarily fascinating about the underside of a squash vine. "Nora," Henry said, without turning his head. "I am not here," Nora said. "You are very much here," he said. "I am barely here," she said. Louisa laughed. It came out of her completely without permission, clear and warm, and Henry looked at her when she laughed with an expression that rearranged everything she had thought she understood about what the next year of her life was going to look like. Life on the Hadley ranch in November had its own particular rhythm, and Louisa learned it in all its textures and demands. The cattle were moved to the lower pastures before the first cold snaps. The cedar wood was cut and stacked in quantities that seemed excessive until the first norther came through, and the temperature dropped 40 degrees overnight, and everyone was grateful for every cord. The accounts for the year were tallied, and the decisions about which stock to sell and which to keep through winter were made in the kitchen over 3 evenings of maps and ledgers and conversation that ranged wide, from the price of cattle at the San Antonio market, to the prospects for the coming year, to the slow, measured process of two people learning each other. Henry wrote to Pemberton with a formal request to proceed with the legal inquiry into the false accusation against Louisa. Pemberton, it emerged, had connections in Austin through his former legal practice, and within 3 weeks he had located 2 members of Gerald Parsons' household staff who were willing, for the modest comfort of not being complicit in their employer's misconduct, to provide statements attesting that no brooch of the described nature had gone missing, and that the description of the complaint was inconsistent with the facts they had personally observed. When Henry brought this news home, Louisa was making bread at the kitchen table, and Mattie was sitting on the opposite stool allegedly helping, but primarily eating the extra dough. Henry came in with the letter from Pemberton, and he read it to Louisa standing at the table, while Mattie tried to hide the dough evidence, and Louisa's hands went still on the bread, and she stood there, while the relief of it moved through her so completely that for a moment her vision went a little blurry. "He can't pursue the civil charge without the supporting testimony," Henry said, "and with 2 counter-testimonies from his own household, any court in Texas would throw it out. Pemberton is sending a formal notice to Parsons' attorney advising him that any further pursuit of the complaint will result in a defamation action." "Will he stop?" Louisa asked. "Pemberton believes he will," Henry said. "Men like Parson are very willing to use the law to frighten people they think won't fight back. They're much less willing when the fight comes back at them." Louisa looked down at the bread in her hands. She felt the particular lightness of a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its exact shape until the moment it began to lift. "Mama," Mattie said helpfully from the other stool, and then went immediately scarlet and silent, and the kitchen went very quiet. Henry looked at his daughter. Louisa looked at Mattie. Mattie looked at the bread dough with the expression of a person who would very much like the ground to open and provide a dignified exit. "I didn't mean," Mattie started. "I know," Louisa said gently. "Come here." Mattie came, warily, and Louisa pulled her onto her hip and held her for a moment, and she looked at Henry over the child's dark head, and something passed between them, some acknowledgement, some reckoning with what was being built here and what it would require of everyone involved. It was Caleb who was the harder conversation. Caleb had been watching the change in the household with the attentiveness of a boy trying to determine whether something was safe to trust. He was 15, old enough to understand what was happening between his father and Louisa, and he carried his mother's memory with a ferocity that was both admirable and painful to witness. In December, on a Sunday afternoon when the house was quiet and Henry was checking fences, and the younger children were playing somewhere in the back, Caleb came and sat across from Louisa at the kitchen table and folded his hands in a gesture so like his father's that it ached. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "Are you going to stay?" Louisa looked at him steadily. "I believe so," she said. "If your father and I can come to an arrangement that makes sense." "And what about my mother?" he said. "I need to know if you understand that she was here, that she was real, that she's not going to be packed away somewhere." There was a rawness in his voice that he was working hard to control, and Louisa felt the full weight of what he was asking, not just the words but everything underneath them. "Caleb," she said, "I never met your mother and I cannot pretend otherwise. But I can tell you what I know of her from the 4 of you. And what I know is that she raised children of extraordinary courage and intelligence and feeling. And that the way your father speaks of her even now is the way a man speaks of someone who was the absolute best thing in his life." She paused. "That doesn't diminish because someone new comes along. It doesn't work like that. Your mother will be real and present in this house as long as any of you are in it." Caleb was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands. Then, "She would have liked you," he said roughly. "She was particular about people, but she would have liked you." It was the highest compliment he had in his possession, and they both knew it, and the fact that it cost him was the measure of his generosity in giving it. Henry asked Louisa to marry him on the 21st of December, which was the longest night of the year. He had, she later discovered, spent considerable time deciding on the timing, because Henry Hadley was a man who believed in doing things properly. He had spoken to Pemberton to ensure the legal situation with Parson was fully resolved before he asked, because he would not propose to a woman while she was still under a threat he was trying to remove, because that would make his help into leverage, and he was not that kind of man. He came to her after the children were in bed on the solstice evening, and he had built the sitting-room fire up properly, which was notable because he usually kept it modest for economy, and he stood in front of it with his hands at his sides, and he said, "I know we have not known each other long. I know the circumstances by which we met were complicated. I know that what I am asking requires trust, and that trust has not always been freely given to you, or earned by the people who demanded it." He stopped, he looked at her. "I am 31 years old," he said. "I have 4 children who love you. I have a ranch that is solvent and a future that I would like to share. And I have," he paused, and the careful formality cracked just slightly, just enough, "found myself, against my better judgment and without particularly intending to, completely unwilling to contemplate a future that doesn't have you in it." Louisa looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. The night outside was cold and still. "Henry Hadley," she said, "that is the most efficiently romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. Was it romantic enough?" He asked with a concern that was completely genuine. "It was exactly right," she said. "Yes. Yes, it was romantic enough, or yes, you'll marry me." "Both," she said. He crossed the room and took her hands, and they stood in front of the fire for a while with the solstice dark outside the windows and the house quiet around them. And Louisa felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely name, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in February of 1879, on a Saturday, in the small stone church in Hadley Creek. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Miller, who had a fondness for thorough sermons that was balanced by Mrs. Miller's strategic coughs whenever he exceeded 12 minutes. It was a cold, bright day with a blue sky that looked like it had been painted, and the cedar trees on the hills had that particular winter clarity to them, sharp and clean in the pale light. Caleb stood up with his father. Nora and Mattie scattered wildflowers that had been dried and kept from the previous summer's picking. James wore his good boots without complaint, which was considered by the family to be a sign of the occasion's significance. Mrs. Kramer, who considered herself personally responsible for the entire arrangement, and was not incorrect in this assessment, cried throughout the ceremony with unashamed satisfaction. Louisa wore a dress of blue-gray wool that she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, sitting with Nora in the evenings while they worked on it together, Nora holding the fabric while Louisa cut and stitched, the two of them talking in the unhurried way that had grown between them, easy and warm and honest. The color of the dress was not accidental. It was the color of Henry's eyes in good weather. He noticed. He did not say it in so many words, because he was Henry, but when she came down the church steps to meet him, his expression said everything that his careful vocabulary declined to specify, and that was eloquence enough. The ranch received her as a wife in a way it had not quite received her as a housekeeper, not because the work was different, much of it was the same, but because the standing was different. She had a place in the decisions now, in the plans, in the future that was being built season by season from the limestone and cedar and stubborn persistence of the Texas hill country. She and Henry sat over the account books together in the evenings as equals, and when she saw a better arrangement for the household accounts and proposed it, he listened and agreed and implemented it without the slightest difficulty, and she loved him particularly for that, for the complete absence of pride in the way he absorbed new information. Spring came in March with the extravagance of a country that had saved its best performance for the right audience. The hills went green in a way that seemed almost impossible after the brown of winter, and the wildflowers came in waves, first the henbit and the chickweed, then the bluebonnets in their great blue sheets across the limestone meadows, then the paintbrush and the verbena, and every variety of thing that the hill country produced in its brief and brilliant spring flowering. Mattie brought Louisa a fistful of bluebonnets one morning, with the solemn ceremony of someone presenting an ambassador's credentials, and Louisa put them in the blue and white pitcher on the windowsill and kissed the top of Mattie's head, and Mattie leaned against her with a satisfaction so complete it was almost visible. The flat-voiced man never came back. Pemberton's letter to Parsons' attorney had apparently done its work. By March, Louisa had stopped turning to look whenever she heard a horse on the road, and by April she had stopped dreaming about it, and by May it was simply a thing that had happened, a dark passage that she had traveled through and come out the other side of, and the other side was this: the morning light on the hills, Henry's boots on the porch, Mattie's bluebonnets in the pitcher, and the specific warmth of a life that was genuinely hers. She wrote to her brother in the spring. It was time. She had been afraid to write him from fear that the letter would be intercepted or traced, but that danger was past now, and she missed him, and she had things to tell him. His name was Thomas, and he was 2 years younger than she was, and his debt, the one that Gerald Parson had used as leverage, had been resolved through his own efforts in the month since she left Austin. He had taken a position as a surveyor's assistant and paid it down steadily, the way their father had always said honest debts were paid, a little at a time and without flinching. Thomas wrote back in June, a long letter full of astonishment at the shape of his sister's life, and with a formality that made her smile, he addressed his greetings to Mr. Henry Hadley and offered his warmest regards to the children. He came to visit in the autumn of that same year, riding the stage in from Fredericksburg with a surveying satchel and a manner that was so recognizably the male version of Louisa's own careful self-possession that Henry liked him immediately, and the children adopted him inside 48 hours. Thomas stayed 2 weeks. He spent most of it in the company of James and Nora, who were 11 by then and deeply interested in maps and measurements, a coincidence that delighted him. He and Henry sat on the porch in the evenings with their coffee, and Louisa could hear them talking from the kitchen, easy and unhurried, and she felt the specific pleasure of 2 people she loved finding each other worth liking. On the last evening before Thomas left, he and Louisa sat alone on the porch after the children were in bed and Henry had gone inside. The autumn night was full of stars, the way hill country nights are, without competition, and the air smelled of dry grass and cedar and the wood smoke from the evening's fire. "You look entirely different," Thomas said. "I don't mean your face, I mean the way you're standing." "How am I standing?" she asked. "Like somewhere is yours," he said. "It was simply observed and exactly right." She thought about it for a while, then she said, "I spent a long time not being able to let things be mine, even when they were." "I know," he said. "So did I after a fashion." He paused. "He's a good man, Louisa." "He is," she said. "He genuinely is." "He looked at you at supper," Thomas said, "the way Papa used to look at Mama, like the room was better organized by your being in it." She laughed. "That is either very romantic or a comment on my housekeeping." "With Henry Hadley," Thomas said, "it is almost certainly both." It was true. Henry expressed affection with a particular practicality that was entirely his own. He replaced the board on the kitchen step that had been slightly uneven since before Louisa's arrival, because she had caught her skirt on it twice, and he found the fact of her catching her skirt on it intolerable now that he had noticed. He had built a better shelf in the kitchen for the good crockery without being asked, because he had noticed her stretching for it, and he disliked the structural inadequacy of the arrangement. He had learned, silently and without announcement, how she took her coffee, when she wanted quiet and when she wanted conversation, which arguments between the children required his intervention, and which were better resolved by Louisa's approach. And he brought her wildflowers sometimes, not with ceremony, not on any particular occasion, just because he had been riding the far pasture and had seen bluebonnets growing along the creek and had thought of her. He would bring them in wrapped in his handkerchief and set them on the kitchen table and not say anything about it. And the first time he did it, she had looked at the flowers and looked at him and felt something so uncomplicated and so complete that it was very nearly impossible to contain. "You brought me flowers," she said. "Creeks full of them," he said, in a tone that implied this was simple logistics. She kissed him on the cheek, which was all that decorum strictly allowed in the kitchen with children potentially in earshot, and he went slightly red in a way she found absolutely extraordinary in a man who had faced down cattle thieves and droughts and property debts without flinching. By the following summer, she knew she was expecting a child. She told Henry on a Tuesday evening in late June, and he sat down at the kitchen table with the deliberateness of a man ensuring that he was stationary before the full weight of the information arrived. And then he looked at her with an expression that was not any single identifiable emotion, but was rather a complete landscape of them, joy and awe and a specific tenderness, and something else she recognized as a man walking back through his own history and finding it somehow redeemed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am very well." He was quiet for a moment. "I should send for the doctor to confirm, Henry," she said. "I know." He stood up. He crossed to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her with all that complicated emotional landscape very clear and very open in the gray-green of his eyes. "We should tell the children," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight let's keep it for ourselves." He nodded. He pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, and they stood in the kitchen with the evening light coming through the window and the sound of the children somewhere outside, and Louisa thought, this is what it was all for. The escaping and the running and the dark passage and the cold porch in the dawn and the arms around her waist. The children received the news the following morning at breakfast with a range of reactions that were entirely characteristic. Caleb, who was now 16, said nothing for a moment and then said, "Good," in a voice that meant considerably more than that single word, and went back to his eggs. Nora shrieked with a joy so complete and immediate that the cat fled the kitchen. James said, "Is it going to be a boy?" with an air of having strong preferences that he was attempting to present as scientific inquiry. Maddie got down from her chair and walked around the table and put her hand flat on Louisa's stomach with a solemnity that stilled the whole table. Then she looked up at Louisa with her father's gray-green eyes. "This one will know from the beginning," she said. "This one won't ever be sad like I was." Louisa covered Maddie's small hand with her own. "No," she said. "This one will know from the beginning. The pregnancy was healthy." Louisa was not a woman who made a great deal of drama of physical difficulty, and she maintained the household with minimal modification throughout the summer and fall, accepting Henry's help with the heavier tasks without the argument she might have put up earlier, because she had learned by then that accepting help from someone who loved you was not weakness, but a kind of trust. It was the same trust she had failed to extend when she packed her bag in the dark and tried to walk away from the porch. She was learning to reverse that instinct, to stand still instead of running, to let things be hers. Henry was attentive in the specific way that he did everything, practically and thoroughly, and without excessive fuss. He made sure the bedroom was warm. He ensured she was not lifting anything unreasonable. He rode to Fredericksburg in October for the particular herbs that the local midwife, a capable German woman named Mrs. Bauer, had requested, and he came back with them plus 3 books that had been published on the subject of maternal health, because Henry Hadley faced every challenge with information. Their son arrived on a November morning in 1880, during a light rain that turned the cedar trees silver. He was born in the bedroom of the Hadley ranch house, with Mrs. Bauer presiding and Henry in the sitting room being very still and very controlled and listening through the walls. When Mrs. Bauer opened the door and said that both mother and child were well, Henry stood up from his chair and went in. He was a broad, strong baby with Louisa's brown hair and Henry's set expression, which on a newborn was both amusing and unmistakable. Henry held him with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 4 times before, and the practiced ease dropped away almost immediately into something much less composed. "Hello," Henry said to the baby, very quietly. "I'm your father." The baby looked at him with the unfocused, imperious gaze of the newborn, apparently reserving judgment. "He's skeptical," Louisa said from the bed. "He's his mother's son," Henry said. Then he looked at Louisa, and the openness on his face was the most complete version of it she had ever seen. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For all of it," he said. "For staying." She looked at him with the new person between them, small and warm and entirely real. "Maddie wouldn't let me leave," she said. "Maddie helped," he said. "But you chose to stay." This was true. She had chosen. She had set down the bag and turned around and begun telling the truth, and the life had opened up from that single decision, the way country opens up after a long mountain pass, wide and light and more than you had let yourself hope for. They named the baby William Thomas Hadley, William for Henry's father and Thomas for Louis's brother. Thomas was notified by letter immediately, and arrived 3 weeks later looking stunned with happiness, and carrying a ridiculous quantity of survey maps he intended to show James, plus a carved wooden horse for William that he had commissioned from a craftsman in Fredericksburg. William proved to be a cheerful and sociable infant who regarded the household with the calm authority of a person who has arrived exactly where he intended and finds it satisfactory. Maddie appointed herself his primary protector, a role she held with fierce dedication. Nora taught him songs before he was old enough to understand them. James informed him regularly and in detail about the practical requirements of ranch life, preparation that was considered premature by everyone but James. Caleb, who was 17, held the baby with a care that was very moving in a boy who had spent the past 2 years cultivating a studied indifference to sentiment. He looked at William's face and then at Louis's and said, "He has your chin." It was, from Caleb, an act of profound inclusion. The seasons came and went over the Hadley ranch in the way that seasons do in the Texas Hill Country, each one distinct, each one demanding. The winters were cold and close. The whole family gathered into the warmth of the main house with its good cedar fires and its accumulated domesticity. The springs were extravagant and brief. The summers were hot and long and full of the constant labor of keeping a cattle operation in order. The falls were the most beautiful thing Louisa had seen in any geography, the scrub oak turning color on the hills, the sumac going scarlet, the air cooling to something you wanted to breathe deeply. She learned the land. She had been a Virginia girl, then an Austin girl, and she had come to the hill country as a stranger to its particular personality. But she learned it the way you learn a person you love, not all at once but in details and accumulations, the way the limestone bluffs held the morning cold, the way the creek ran clear after rain, the particular quality of light in November that was not like November anywhere else. Henry watched her learn it with a satisfaction that was entirely private and therefore more telling. He caught himself watching her at the kitchen window, looking out at the hills with that attentive expression she had when she was taking something in rather than just seeing it. He caught himself wanting to show her things, the spring where the deer came at dusk, the ridge to the west where you could see 40 miles on a clear day, the Indian pictographs on the limestone face of the canyon that his father had shown him when he was Caleb's age. He took her to the ridge on a Sunday in November, the two of them on horseback through the cedar and mesquite while the children held the ranch, and they sat up there on the limestone edge with 40 miles of hill country below them and the autumn sky above, and Louisa looked out at it with her particular stillness, and then she said, "This is one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen." "I know," he said. "I wanted you to see it." She looked at him. He was looking at the view with a satisfaction that she recognized as something complicated, the specific pleasure of sharing something you love with someone you love, the two things compounding. "Henry," she said, "I would like you to know," she said carefully, "that I am happier than I have ever been in my life." He turned to look at her. The wind was moving his hair the way it always did up on the ridge, and the light was on his face, and the gray-green of his eyes was all the way open. "So am I," he said. "I wasn't certain I'd be this again. I thought when Clara died that the capacity for it had closed off somewhere. I was wrong." She reached across and took his hand where it rested on his knee, and he turned it over and held hers, and they sat up there on the ridge with the hill country laid out below them and November going golden on the scrub oak. And it was a moment so complete that Louisa filed it carefully into the permanent collection of things she intended to keep. As the years settled into their pattern, the Hadley household changed shape gradually, the way households do. Caleb, who turned 18 in the spring after William's birth, took on the eastern pasture management and worked alongside Henry with a seriousness of purpose that made Henry proud in a way he rarely expressed directly, but everyone could see. By 19, he was a man in every practical sense, capable and decided, and still carrying his mother's memory with that particular ferocity that had softened by now into something more like gratitude than grief. The twins, James and Nora, grew into themselves in the way of twins who are entirely unlike. James broad-shouldered and literal and endlessly practical, Nora fine-boned and observant and possessed of a dry wit that regularly startled adults who had not been paying attention. They fought less than they used to and conspired more, which Henry regarded with a philosophical wariness. Maddie turned 9, and then 10, and she remained Louisa's shadow in the way that she had been since the first day, though the shadow had changed character as she grew, from pure attachment to something more like companionship, the two of them working the kitchen garden together in the summer evenings, or riding out together on Sunday afternoons on the gentle mare Louisa had learned on. Maddie had absorbed her father's directness and her mother's precision, and she expressed her love with a specificity that was occasionally overwhelming. She gave Louisa a small book she had made herself for Louisa's 29th birthday, handwritten on paper she had sewn together with thread, listing in her careful child's hand every single thing she loved about Louisa, organized by category: kindness, cleverness, cooking, the way she smelled like lavender, the way she never made anyone feel stupid, the way she had stayed. The last item on the list read, "She stayed even though she didn't have to, and I held on to her and she didn't leave." Louisa kept the book in the drawer of the nightstand on her side of the bed, and she never mentioned it to Maddie, because she understood that some gifts are too large for the ordinary handling of gratitude. When Louisa discovered she was expecting again, in the spring of 1882, it was during a period of particular contentment. William was walking and talking in the unstoppable way of 18-month-olds, and the ranch had had 2 good years, and Henry and she had fallen into a rhythm of life together that was so natural and so thorough that she occasionally marveled at the narrowness of the margin by which it had all come to exist. She had almost left. She had been on the step with her bag in her hand. One 6-year-old's arms had been the thing that changed it. She told Henry the news on the evening of the last warm day in April, when they were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, and the night was full of the smell of spring grass and the creek running. She said it simply and directly, because she had learned with Henry that simplicity was always the right approach. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand in both of his and held it in his lap with a solidity and a warmth that said everything his careful vocabulary was still assembling. "A second," he said. "A second," she confirmed. He looked up at the stars. He exhaled. And then he laughed, which was still one of the things she most loved, because he didn't do it often, and when he did it was genuine and warm, and it changed his face entirely, the limestone formality of it releasing into something altogether more open. "James is going to say he told me so," he said. "James has been lobbying for a brother since October," she said. "He has," Henry agreed. "He presented a case." "He wrote it down," she said. "He footnoted it," Henry said. She was still laughing when he kissed her, right there on the porch in the warm spring dark, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating under her palms, steady and certain, and she thought, "This is the life. This specific, improbable, almost missed life. The second child was a boy, as it happened, born in November of 1882. They named him Robert, for no particular reason except that it suited him, and he came into the world with a quantity of opinions that he began expressing immediately and did not moderate for the next several years. James received this development with the satisfaction of a man whose strategic forecasting has been vindicated. William and Robert grew up as inseparable as the original twins were, though their personalities were as different as winter and spring. William was measured and watchful, his father's disposition with his mother's eyes. Robert was vivid and loud, and threw himself at everything with a fearlessness that aged Louisa marginally, but that Henry watched with a specific pride that he disguised as concern and fooled no one. By 1885, the Hadley household was 6 children strong, the 4 original ones and the 2 additions, and it was loud and full and demanding and wonderful in the specific way of houses that have been built up from grief and work and love into something more durable than any of those things separately. Caleb married in 1884, a young woman named Ruth from a neighboring ranch, calm and sensible and possessed of opinions about animal husbandry that made James deeply happy to have someone to argue with. Henry gave Caleb the eastern pasture and the small house that had been the original homestead cabin, renovated into something comfortable and proper, and Caleb went into his own life with Ruth in the way of a man who has been well prepared by the people who raised him. At the wedding, Henry stood with Louisa at the edge of the gathering and watched Caleb and Ruth accept congratulations from the assembled neighbors with a composure that was clearly Caleb's own inheritance, and Henry had Louisa's hand in his and William on his hip and Robert being held back from the wedding cake by James with the effort of someone managing a force of nature. "He's going to be all right," Louisa said. "He was always going to be all right," Henry said. "He's made of good material." She looked up at him. "He is," she said. "He gets it from both his parents." Henry looked at her then with an expression that she had seen grow and deepen over the 6 years of their marriage, that open landscape of a face that he kept reserved and only offered when something moved him past his considerable self-possession. It still undid her every time. It would probably always undo her. "You know," he said quietly, "I think about that morning sometimes, when Mattie caught you on the porch." "So do I," she said. "I had been downstairs for almost 20 minutes before she went after you," he said. "I had found the note. I was standing at the kitchen window trying to decide what I was going to do." She looked at him. "Were you going to stop me?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I wanted to, but I was trying to determine whether I had the right." He paused. "Mattie didn't deliberate." "Mattie never deliberates," Louisa said. "No," he said. "She just goes after what matters." Louisa turned to look at their daughter, who was 9 now and currently in charge of keeping Robert away from the cake, and apparently being defeated in this mission by her older brother James taking over the Robert management, so she could have a piece herself. The afternoon light caught her dark hair and her father's gray-green eyes and the complete, unapologetic joy with which she inhabited every moment of her life. "She saved me," Louisa said. "I know that sounds overstated, but she did." "She saved us," Henry said. "The whole household." He squeezed her hand. Robert made a successful break for the cake table and James said something that was not quite a word. Nora, who was now 13 and possessed of a certain lofty authority in the family, intercepted Robert with the efficiency of someone who had been managing chaos for years. William watched all of this with his measured expression and then calmly ate his own cake. Louisa looked at all of it, the full, complicated, improbable landscape of it, the children and the ranch and the hill country hills and Henry's hand in hers. She had been on that porch step with her bag in her hand. She had been 30 seconds from the road. She had had a plan that she had been certain was the right one, the safe one, the only one that protected people from the consequences of her difficult circumstances. And Mattie had wrapped both arms around her waist, and the plan had ended, and the life had begun. That evening after the wedding, when the guests had gone and the children were in various stages of collapse around the house, Henry and Louisa sat on the porch in the way that had become the most reliable constant of their life together, the evening porch, the ending of the day. The hill country night came in with its stars and its cedar smell and its absolute silence, the kind of silence that is not absence but presence, the sound of a place that is entirely itself. Robert was asleep on Henry's shoulder, having fought sleep for 3 hours and then surrendered in a heap. William was inside already. Nora and James were talking in the low voices of people wrapping up the day. Maddie was somewhere between asleep and awake on the porch bench beside Louisa, her head on Louisa's leg, her breathing slow and even. Henry looked across Maddie's head at Louisa with the full version of his expression, the one he didn't moderate. "Louisa," he said quietly. She said, "Are you content?" It was not a small question. It was, in the vocabulary of a man who chose every word carefully, the biggest question he had in his possession. She looked at the stars. She looked at the hills. She felt Maddie's warmth against her leg and Henry's eyes on her face, and the familiar smell of cedar and wood smoke, and the particular Texas night. "Henry," she said, "I am so content that I sometimes wonder if I'm managing it correctly." He made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh and the end of an exhale. "I believe there's no incorrect way." "That is a very reassuring position," she said. He reached across Maddie and took her hand in the same way he had been taking it since the beginning, with both of his, and held it with a steady and complete certainty. And the night went on around them, the stars wheeling overhead, the cedar trees quiet on the hills, the creek somewhere below running over its smooth limestone bed, the Hadley ranch quiet and whole, and exactly what it had become in the years since a frightened woman with a traveling bag had been stopped on a porch step by a 6-year-old's arms. In the morning there would be work to do, the endless and specific work of a cattle ranch in good order, and there would be children to manage, and the 1,000 small decisions of a shared life. There would be letters from Thomas and visits from the Kremers and the ongoing agricultural deliberations of James, who had decided at 11 that he intended to run the western pasture, and had been acquiring competencies toward this end ever since. There would be Ruth coming over to help with the kitchen in the way of a daughter-in-law, finding her footing and doing it well. There would be William's measuring gaze taking in everything, and Robert's boundless velocity, and Nora's dry precision, and Maddie's particular fierceness of love. There would be Henry at the kitchen table in the first light with his coffee and his maps, and Louisa at the window looking at the hills that were hers now, fully and permanently hers. The way the children were hers and the man was hers and the life was hers, not by accident or by someone's mercy but by her own choice, made on a porch in the cold dawn when she turned back from the step and began telling the truth. She did not leave. She had chosen to stay. And the life that had grown from that single decision was so much larger and deeper, and more various than anything she had imagined on that September stagecoach, that she sometimes thought about the frightened woman with $47 and a bruised heart, and felt a love for her that was almost maternal, a tenderness for the difficulty of the passage she had not yet known was going to end here. It had ended here, in this. In the cedar hills and the gray-green eyes, and the 6-year-old who had grown up into a 10-year-old, who was asleep with her head on Louisa's leg in the warm dark of a Texas evening, breathing steadily, profoundly at peace, exactly where she had always believed she would end up, with the woman she had refused to let go. Henry leaned back in his chair and looked up at the stars, and Louisa looked at the side of his face in the dark, that profile that she knew now as well as she knew the hills, and she felt the particular gratitude of someone who has been lucky in the most complete and undeserved way, lucky past all reasonable expectation. She had been on the porch step. She had been going. And she had been caught by love, not the large and obvious variety, but the small and precise and absolute kind, a child's arms, a man's gray-green eyes, a life she had been too frightened to ask for opening itself around her anyway, patient and certain, waiting for her to stop running long enough to receive it. She squeezed Henry's hand. He squeezed back without looking, the reflexive certainty of a man who does not need to look to know where she is. The stars turned above the hill country. The cedar trees stood still in the night air. The creek ran below, clear over limestone, the same as it had always run, the same as it would run long after all of them were gone, bearing witness in the quiet, permanent way of moving water to the fact that something real had happened here, something built and chosen and held onto against the inclination to flee, and that it had been, in every measure that mattered, enough. More than enough. Precisely and exactly and fully enough. The Hadley Ranch in Mason County, Texas, in the year 1885 was a home. It had been a home before Louisa Norris arrived, and it would be a home long after the children were grown, and it was most completely itself now, in the evening dark, with the man and the woman and the sleeping child and the stars above and the hills below, everything that had been broken carefully made, everything that had been lost quietly honored, everything that was present fully claimed. Louisa Norris had tried to leave before supper on an October morning in 1878, and Henry Hadley's youngest had wrapped both arms around her waist, and the rest had been, season by season and year by year, the beautiful and particular life that followed.